Underwriters of the Arizona Mining Review include Mining Foundation of the Southwest, a nonprofit organization based in Tucson, Arizona, working to educate the public about mineral resources and the mineral extraction and processing industries. Amigos, Southwest Buyer's Guide. For almost 40 years, Amigos has worked to provide a better business environment for mining. Pioneer Equipment Incorporated, serving the equipment needs of the mining industry since 1959. And Copper State Bolt and Nut Company, in business since 1972 with 21 branches to serve you.
It's Wednesday, July 29, 2015. This is the Arizona Mining Review. I'm your host, Lee Allison, here at the Arizona Geological Survey in Tucson. And joining us today from the National Mining Association in Washington, D.C. is Katie Sweeney, who's the General Counsel for NMA. Katie, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Lee. Appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Well, great. I know you and I have talked over the years on a lot of different topics related to mining, but we've asked you here today because the NMA has put out a new report that you've commissioned to look at the impacts of permitting, and particularly permitting delays at government levels on mining projects. And could you give us a little background? What prompted you to take a look at this issue?
Well, Lee, obviously permitting has been a problem that NMA's members have identified and been concerned about for quite some time. It's no surprise to any of NMA's member companies that it's about a 7 to 10 year permitting process here in the United States. And we have had questions from our allies and friends on the Hill and other policymakers asking us, well, what does that delay really mean? Does it make us less competitive when compared to other mining nations? And so that's why we commissioned SNL to do this study for us, permitting economic value in mining in the United States, to quantify what are the impacts of these delays on projects and how those delays discourage investment in projects here in the United States. The study finds that on average, a mine can lose a third of its value while waiting for the permits that it needs to get in that 7 to 10 year period. And if commodity prices change and construction costs go up, then it could be half of the value of the mine is lost while waiting that 7 to 10 year period.
Okay, well now you mentioned 7 to 10 years here in the U.S., and I think we're going to get into one of the Arizona projects that's in that time frame. How does that compare with permitting periods in other countries?
Well, I like to compare it with Canada and Australia because I think that there's wide recognition that those two countries have very similar environmental standards compared to the U.S. And in those countries, major mining projects generally get their permits in about 2 to 3 years.
Wow, a third, a quarter to a third of the time of the U.S. And without giving up the environmental standards is what...
Right, and I think that's really important because I know that there are some folks on the Hill that express concern about these permitting bills that have been introduced by Representative Amodei and Senator Murkowski, and they think that somehow there's some, we're getting a pass on the environment, but we're not. We're just trying to make the permitting system more efficient.
Right. Well, one of the case studies in this report that just came out is of the Rosemont copper mine that's been proposed here for quite a few years south of Tucson, and you mentioned potential or the loss in value of those mines. Can you summarize what you found or what the study found on the Rosemont permitting process and the impact on that property?
Absolutely. So the Rosemont example is one that we continue from a previous SNL study that we commissioned last year on U.S. mines to market, where we actually traced the value of mined commodities in the U.S. into manufacturing in the United States. And we used in that study Rosemont as an example of how you just cannot get the minerals out of the ground because the permitting system is so long So it was no surprise that we went back to the Rosemont example for this study as well. Rosemont, that's such a great project. You guys in Arizona are very lucky to have it. When it's up and running, it could meet up to 10% of the U.S. copper demand. But they're still awaiting their final permits, and it seems endless as they've gone through more than 450 technical studies there. And there's obviously great opportunity for employment and revenues to the state as well. But when you look at what's happened with that project and the impacts that the mining, that the delays have had, it's pretty significant. Just 1 second here. I'm trying to look for the exact stats.
Right. As I read the report, I think I remember you estimating or calculating about a $3 billion economic loss to
Yes,
excessive
correct.
permitting.
Compared to what sort of return on investment Rosemont could have received when if it had gotten permits in the first couple of years, as would be the case in Canada or Australia.
Right.
And it's a great example of why you can see the U.S. is attracting less and less of the worldwide exploration dollars for mining. And a lot of that is tied to the fact it takes so long to get the permits here in the U.S. So in the 80s and 90s, the U.S. attracted over 20% of the worldwide exploration budget, and today it's under 8%.
So, wow, that's like a 50-60% reduction there.
Correct.
That's significant. Well, so the report is entitled Solutions that you're looking at. So what are the solutions that you're proposing to resolve this?
So I think that the most important solution is to facilitate getting the minerals out of the ground in an environmentally sound way. I believe that Representative Mark Amade of Nevada's bill that he introduced, this is the third Congress he's introduced this bill, it's the Strategic and Critical Minerals Production Act, actually has some significant solutions. No environmental shortcuts, but really focusing on ways to eliminate redundancies, duplication, and require enforceable timeframes for the process. So under his bill, you would have 30 months to complete the permitting for major mining projects, though that time frame can be extended if all the stakeholders agree that it's necessary. But it also requires the major federal agencies to cooperate and consult with each other up front, as well as reaching out to the appropriate state agencies and other stakeholders as well.
Okay.
On the Senate side, there's a similar effort, though slightly less robust in that it doesn't have the 30-month time frame. But Senator Murkowski's bill that she introduced this year also does look at how to best coordinate agencies to make sure that the permitting process moves forward more smoothly. And her bill also would require some reports to Congress on what efficiencies have been made, what improvements have been made, and what additional improvements could be made in the future.
It's interesting. I think some of the problems here and the solutions you're proposing seem really well suited to what's going on here with the Rosemont mine, and I think with some other mines in Arizona. Because one thing we have seen, our agency is a cooperator, an official cooperator with the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Forest Service in looking at the Rosemont permitting. And as one agency finishes looking at something, the next agency then takes it on. So it's very much a sequential kind of approach rather than, it sounds like you would have things moving more in parallel and working together from the beginning, and so that you could achieve the same kind of results of reviews, but instead of stretching it out from 7 to 10 years, do it in a 2.5-year period.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the idea behind this. And it also would prevent agencies from coming in at the last minute with new questions and new concerns by making sure that they engage early. Sometimes the Environmental Protection Agency, for example, has been one of the agencies that's been had a finger pointed at it for coming in at the last minute with new concerns and, adding years to the permit process.
Well, that's actually some conversation we've had with EPA officials, not only here in Arizona, but when I was working in Utah, where they, in many cases, see themselves as the agency of last resort. That after every agency that's responsible for land management for permitting finishes their work, they saw themselves as kind of a super agency that would come in and review what everyone else had done and decided what they would want to do. And so, as you say, you come in at the last minute and throw in things that nobody had been concerned about or thinking about, or that they would decide that they would just impose something new into the process. I know it frustrated a lot of the federal agencies that we worked with, who felt they had done a very reasonable job in their land management, and to have another agency come in and second guess them. So that it's caused some tensions not only between people trying to develop mining properties, but other federal agencies who have been trying to carry out their mandates for environmental stewardship and the appropriate regulatory process. So this would seem like it's a way of maybe addressing both sides of this question.
I agree. I think that this really could make serious, if we could get these bills enacted, we'd have serious progress made on this permitting problem.
Do you have any sense, Katie, where these bills are going in Congress?
So the Mark Amodei bill has already been marked up by committee and passed out of subcommittee.
Okay.
It also has passed out of the House the last two Congresses.
Mm-hmm.
So we do anticipate that we will see similar success this Congress as well, probably in the September timeframe. On the Senate side, you may or may not know, but much of Senator Murkowski's minerals bill has been included in her energy package.
Oh, I had not heard that. Okay.
So I think we're very fortunate, and that's an opportunity to have this debated more in the Senate, where this really hasn't had kind of the hearings and such that we've had on the House side. So this is a great opportunity. I think it makes perfect and total sense that Senator Murkowski has incorporated this into the energy package, because as you well know, you can't have any kind of energy production or transmission without minerals. And
Right.
they're critical to all forms of energy production, whether it's renewable or traditional.
Well, and you make a good point, and it's particularly relevant here with Arizona and the Rosemont mine, as well as some others, in that it's a copper mine. And a large part of the copper is used for electrical wiring and in motors and transmission. And so it's key to electrical energy, and the amount of copper that's used in solar energy projects is just staggering. I don't think people realize how many miles of copper wire go into a solar energy project.
And windmills as well. They take an incredible amount of copper.
Okay, all right. Katie, that's really been interesting. This is fascinating. We're going to follow this very closely. And I think if we can see these bills move out of either one of the House or the Senate this fall, we'd like to follow up with you and see where this may be going.
Absolutely.
Well, great. Well, excuse me. Well, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate it, and we'll look forward to talking to you on this and other matters in the near term.
All right. Thanks very much, Lee.
All right. Well, joining us now is Dr. Phil Pearthree, who's the chief of our environmental geology section here at the Geologic Survey. Phil, welcome back.
Thank you.
And we have a new report. Phil's the lead author on it. Geologic Map Database for Aggregate Resource Assessment in the Phoenix metropolitan area and surrounding regions. And we're going to get into this, but joining us by phone right now is Steve Trussell, who's the executive director of the Arizona Rock Products Association. And this report was put together in part to deal with one of the challenges of aggregate resource development in metropolitan area and the conflict with urban development. Steve, thanks for joining us today. And
Absolutely, it's my pleasure, Dr. Allison.
and you know, some of our viewers are not mining experts, not geologists. What are aggregate resources, and why are they so important to the state's economy?
Well, thanks for asking. I had a conversation this morning, and someone said, you know, you all could do a whole lot better job of explaining why what you do is so important. So thank you for giving me my first opportunity, because it's absolutely true. We need to do a better job of educating folks on the importance of aggregates. Aggregates being a combination of sand, gravel, and crushed stone. We mine it and process it in different sizes for different uses. Typically, those are ready-mix concrete and asphalt products. And so, you know, our little mantra is your homes, your roads, your future, your schools, your churches, you name it. And if you look around you, you can see there's quite a bit of ready-mix concrete, which, you know, one of the important products that we mine is limestone for use in cement. Several of the admixtures like gypsum and so forth are also used in cement production, and the cement is the powder or the glue that goes into. We mix that with the water and the sand and gravel of certain sizes, and of course all this material has to meet certain specifications, and you know, that way we can use it in the projects that are important to our local communities.
Okay. Now, ARPA represents a large number of producers in the state. How many members do you have? How many different companies are in the aggregate and sand and gravel business in Arizona?
We don't represent all the companies in Arizona, but we do represent well over 100. And just to give you a general sense of the size of the industry in Arizona, we have 584 facilities, but that includes 191 aggregate mines. That also includes ready-mix concrete and asphalt, as I mentioned before. And we have 3 major cement producers. There's one up in Drake, Arizona, one in Clarkdale, and one in Marana.
Okay. Now, why is it important that aggregate resources be developed nearby urban areas or in urban areas? Why not just go out in remote areas and get away from all of the conflicts with urban development?
That is an excellent question, because a lot of people ask the industry that. Of course, we go to permit hearings, and folks come out to our facilities and they say, why here? Sand and gravel seems to be everywhere. Why can't you mine it wherever? And the answer to that is that number one, as you well know, it's got to be a geologic occurrence that lends itself to the specifications that we have to meet, meaning the type of rock, the hardnesses that we're looking for that can be used for construction materials. So that's number one. Number two is it needs to be close to the market. So, what we want to do is make sure that we are thinking ahead about the planning, because while we can't just mine it anywhere, we want to be where that occurrence is, but that occurrence needs to be close to the market. And of course, if you're close to the market, there's a good chance you might be close to development, in which case there's that urban interface issue that we deal with that some other mining sectors do not. Therefore, we want to make sure that if we are in proximity to development, we're being great neighbors, but also thinking ahead, so to the extent we can help it, we don't do that.
Okay. Now, you've done some economic studies that talk about what happens if you have to start hauling your aggregate, your sand and gravel, the limestone, a longer distance. How far away does it start having if you have to start hauling it from a long distance away, what kind of economic impact does that have on building a house or building a store or school?
That's another excellent question. So for every 20 miles that we're hauling it in, and by the way, 90% of aggregates are used within 50 miles of their project. And so what we want to do is make sure that for several purposes, one is obviously the lion's share of the cost is the transport of the aggregates. And so for every 20 miles, back to my initial point, it doubles the cost. So what you want to do is make sure that, again, we're close to market, and and that also reduces exposure on the roads, wear and tear on the roads, and safety issues are certainly reduced. And then, of course, emissions, because you're not hauling it quite so much.
Okay, good point. Well, we put this report together that Phil was the chief author in response to some legislation that the state legislature passed a few years ago requiring local jurisdictions to start planning for aggregate resources so they didn't zone everything out of existence or build over top of it and inadvertently start doubling or tripling the cost of the resources to build their infrastructure. So I know you and Phil have been talking and we've given you a preview of this report. How do you think we're going to be able to use this to work with local governments and with industry to try to resolve some of these challenges?
Sure. No, we couldn't even begin to express how appreciative we are for the good work of your agency in helping to not only provide the necessary mapping, but as well reports to help people understand and which, the reports that characterize, really what we're dealing with from a scientific basis. So from our standpoint, it's a matter of, and maybe I should give you some history, because historically, if you're familiar with the Growing Smarter legislation, it was some thoughtful legislation that basically stated if you're going to do your planning, whether it's at the municipal or the county level, you really need to consider where certain things are going to come from. Your water supply, be thinking about utilities, conservation lands, and so forth. And we got to thinking, well, that's a great start. And what we'd like to see happen is for folks to think about the materials to build things. So, for example, if you're doing your general planning as a municipality or as a county, and you're thinking about, I think most folks have a general sense, most planners that is, have a general sense of how many developable acres they have in terms of their zoning, and as far as lane miles that are going to accommodate the build out and residential units and so forth. They're going to have. They need to be thinking about where the materials to build that infrastructure is going to come from. So in California, the California Geologic Survey did a study. They looked at 31 municipalities, and they took a look to see, so how many of them have sufficient aggregate reserves permitted to accommodate the need? And the answer is 1 of 31. And when I say reserves, it's a different, the resources may potentially be all over. The reserves are tried and proven, meaning they've looked at those to see if they meet the specifications and so forth. So you certainly don't want to develop over resources because, given reclamation requirements and other things that we can do, we can certainly transform that land into usable land post-mining use. But what you don't want to do is sterilize the aggregates. So that was a huge push for us in 2011. It was part of a larger bill, which was a regulatory Bill of Rights bill, but there was a provision that stated we would really like to get folks thinking about that. Now, that said, we knew that it was incumbent upon the industry to get some consultants together to put together a guidance document that made the compelling case for that, but also made some recommendations and offered up some potential resources. But certainly there are no better resources than that which you all create and assist with, because it shows where those geological occurrences are.
Okay. Well, we'll get to that, but let me step back. You used the word sterilization of resources, and I think I know what you mean, but some of our viewers may not. Can you define what you mean by that?
Sure, and I appreciate you catching that. I simply mean that whenever we plan or zone over a resource that could potentially be mined for use in those projects I described, then that's basically we no longer have access to those materials.
Right. Okay. That's what I thought you were saying, but I just wanted to confirm. So let me turn to Phil. Phil, you've done this study now. You've got a map across the region. in the greater Phoenix area, and you found some areas that basically the aggregate resources have been either zoned out of existence or have been developed and aren't going to be available anymore. But we do have some areas where, particularly it sounds like on the west side of the metropolitan area, out towards Buckeye and places like that, where there are some very substantial resources that have not been zoned out, have not been developed, and are not in conflict with urbanization. And so is that a good place to go out and work with the local community and try to start doing some planning so that they don't make some of the same mistakes other communities have done?
Yeah, certainly. I think quite a lot of the Phoenix metropolitan area is actually built on river deposits that could potentially have been resources, and those are the things that Steve was mentioning that are sterilized, pretty vast areas actually, and obviously they're not going to be exploited for rock products because they've already got stuff built over the top of them.
Right.
So in those more intense urban areas, all the resources that are being extracted now are pretty much from the channel of the floodplain, the areas that aren't developed, because that's where the water goes, and that's the only place they can get aggregate from now, from the big rivers.
Okay.
But a couple of other, certainly out towards the margins, you have the opportunity to recognize these deposits in advance, and we've focused on things like the Hassayampa River, which is kind of way out at the western, sort of beyond the western margin of the Phoenix area, but ultimately may not be. And that's another major river that has some aggregate resource exploitation already, and that probably will have a lot more if development continues out in that way. The Agua Fria in the West Valley is a major source of aggregate, and a lot of that's coming again from the channel and the floodplain. But farther to the north in the Agua Fria, which isn't developed yet, they're pretty extensive river deposits, some of which are older river deposits that might be, I mean, they have to be proven, as Steve mentioned, but they have potential to be major sources of aggregate in the future, and they're not developed yet, so not developed over yet.
Okay.
So those are kind of areas that these maps will point out.
Okay, so you and Steve have been talking, I think, and starting to make some plans. Are there any specific plans in motion right now to start meeting with any particular communities, or how are we going to take this report out and use it with the local communities? What's the next step?
Well, we've had some general discussions. We don't have anything firmly yet, but Mike Conway has been coordinating those efforts to try to set this up, and I think within the next couple months probably we'll try to figure out the best forum to release, to show these maps and explain what they are. The main value of these maps, by the way, is that Steve and Eric Mears, consultant working with them, pointed out we have the geologic resources, and we had them.
Right.
But they weren't in the simplest format to understand, and so the idea with these maps is really to do a systematic and uniform depiction of these deposits at a reasonable scale across the whole area, with map units that are specifically designed to highlight. These are river deposits. These are the big river deposits. These are the next generation of smaller river deposits, and those are the things that have been the main sources of aggregate. So these map units in this map, point to those units explicitly, as opposed to some of our previous maps did not.
Right. Okay. Steve, as I understood it, you were hearing the same thing that we were hearing when planners saw the new law out there. They looked at our geologic maps and said, "Well, we're not geologists. How do I interpret this?" And what we've tried to do is translate a geologic map into a map that planners can understand, and focusing on the nature of rock products. And I think your team, your consultants and advisors have looked at this and seem to think it's going to do the job. So how do you think we might be going forward with translating this and getting it actually implemented on the ground?
Well, that's a good question, and we've already initially been contacted by counties and municipalities, and of course we've been commenting on general planning to let them know that resources, are available or on their way, and certainly have made recommendations that would, if nothing else, just begin the conversation, because certainly we don't want this to be an adversarial conversation. We want it to be a helpful conversation, because at the end of the day, It's going to save taxpayers money. It's going to reduce emissions. There's a whole host of positive benefits, and you know, I'm sure there are many that believe that mining local is sustainable if they understand what that truly means. And of course, there's a lot of responsibility on behalf of the industry, not only to get the word out, to be available and be a resource, but to also try to connect the dots, as you said, to, you know, with the folks in need and the folks that are providing this great information. So I'll give you an example. Town of Buckeye certainly understands that looking forward, and we've been working with the mayor and staff, and they've got some consultants hired to take a look at multiple issues simultaneously, but looking at the industry as a potential partner in all of this, knowing that, you know, they've got a massive area that's been annexed. They're going to need materials to build it out, and want to make sure that in terms of transportation planning and urban interface issues that we mentioned before and so forth, that all of that is dealt with in the initial throes so that we don't have to deal with it after the fact.
Good point. Well, Steve, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate this, and it's been a great partnership. I'm looking forward to actually now working with you as we take this report out and meet with the counties and the communities. And as you point out, we hope this will save taxpayer money, save consumers money, and keep an industry alive that's really needed for the economic, commercial home development across the state. So appreciate you joining us today and looking forward to working with you.
Likewise, thank you for the good work of you and your team. And, you know, if I could just finish by saying, if it can't be grown, it must be mine. And every lane mile of highway is 38,000 tons of aggregate, and
wow.
Your homes, your average 2,000 square foot home is 400 tons of aggregate. So when you get to thinking about those numbers, it certainly gives you, you know, a general sense of the economies of scale we're talking about. And I have a different perspective when I'm driving down a freeway and I'm looking at the stack in Maricopa County or some municipal building in a rural area, and how much material it took to build that. So appreciate your comments.
All right. Thanks, Steve. Look forward to talking to you soon.
Likewise.
All right. Bye-bye.